art. You have already learned too much nonsense. Embrace all techniques, apply all 40 hours through the day. Keep breathing, turn your back to the critic and curators of common sense. Just find something you love and do it. I believe in you. Open.
I'm not interested in manifestos and prescriptivism. I keep seeing all sorts of art discourse that says thou shalt and you should do this or this is what works, and kind of sick of it. So for my artistic statement, I just kind of wanted to say these are just ideas. Use them. I'm not interested in manifestos and prescriptivism. I want the potential work their practice might pose. All these arguments for me just seem to turn themselves inside out. Instead of prescribed behaviors, they're just like, hey, what if you did this? Or hey, what if you did that? A good example is vorticism. I mean, it's a beautiful form. There's all this font play, and stuff that people are still tinkering with. There's even graffiti artists right now today that are playing with the idea of font size and shape and what that does to the character of the word. And I think that's a really beautiful thing. But at the same time, you don't need a street artist telling you what to do, which is not to say they can't. They're just saying that I don't like it. And it's not just specifically street artists, it's all artists. Why have all these prescribed behaviors when you could just say, hey, try this, it does that. And I think that's a much more interesting way to proceed with life. There's a great example of this. Ted Forbes has a wonderful site called Art of Photography, which I'll put a link to on the feed. And he does a wonderful job of expressing the ideas of rules and concepts and principles. It says that some of the greatest art breaks them. Some of it has done such a wonderful job of integrating these ideas that they no longer need to really think about them consciously, which I think tends to be the case with great art. So your mileage may vary, but that's my take on it. I want fluency in all postures. There can never be enough concern. I mean, especially in this day and age, there just can't be enough concern. There can't be enough interest. There can't be enough attention to detail. There's no way for us to get all the work that needs to be done in the art world to fight off and resist the shit we're living in right now. And if we aren't working kind of together to do that, then we're really kidding ourselves. Are we artists? Are we activists? What are we? What are we doing with this stuff? But ultimately, whatever you put the camera on, whatever subject you choose, whatever you write about, that concern puts into the world more and more of you and your subjectivity, and also your desire for change and for the things that you want in the world. So what you look at, in some ways, you become. Each work has potential alone, and the hybrid amalgam work of many yields to the time we live in, giving ground. There isn't going back, per se. There's only more work in the way it interconnects with other work. The hybridity of the text, the interconnection, the intersections of texts. I'm thinking lines of flight here are all very important in the ways that we're only beginning to understand about the internet and how it works. Art's always been doing that. Text has always been doing it. Hypertext is king. Or queen. And it's how everything interconnects and how we ascribe meaning and understand the world about us. That web, if you will, is something that we're adding to. So we need to be conscious of that at all times. And then if we're giving of ourselves, then we're doing our job. If we're not, if we're creating something to be sold or auctioned or to connote status, or we're just going to hang our shit in galleries. Well, kind of fuck you. You know, good on you for making money, and good on you for putting it in that fucking space. But God damn it, we need art that's alive now, not tomorrow, not to be hung up somewhere. That only adds to the sort of it's not a political move on the part of the artist. It adds to the deadness of the art, the way the art is captured and capitalized by hegemony. And it's absolutely death to art. So by the time that we see that, if we're looking at a Van Gogh in a museum and not worried about the fact that he was concerned about everyday people and about capturing what the proletariat or the serf or the person gaining the wheat or the farmer, if we're not concerned about those people anymore, then we're not really making art. We're just making really rich people even richer. And we'll never see any of that income anyways. So fuck it. Give ground like a seductive dance where the listener steps into the space you just left behind for them to enter. One of the things I'm always thinking about is the intersections between all the different disciplines. Particularly for me, dance is really effective. The idea of even courtship dances where people are moving into spaces that you invite them into as the quote-unquote lead. That's kind of almost the role of the artist or the philosopher or the thinker or even the demagogue, unfortunately, whom we seem very prone to follow these days. But the truth is that a lot of art is yielding. It doesn't have to be yielding, but that's the kind of art I prefer. Every taste has its value. Even a face after a fist fight is edible. Like the tongue misses the tooth, the tang of it, to swallow up. Give up on cultivating aesthetic practice and value judgment as art. I'm being a little cheeky here when I talk about a face after a fist fight being edible. I don't really mean I eat faces or I think people should. But I think that there's an interesting thing in that statement that's bothered me since I wrote it, and it bothers me in the work of great poets like Douglas Kearney, who talks about cannibalism and people eating each other all the time. I talk about it incessantly. But I think if you look realistically at the art around us and you look at realistically at the world around us, it seems like everyone's consuming everyone else. Devour to survive. It's how it's always been. A very loose quote of Maynard James Keenan of Tool. And there's got to be a way of looking at the world where there's more commensalism or win-win scenarios for both people, where people are more equal. And I don't, again, this isn't a manifesto, it's just what I want. I want this in my art. I want sort of an equality and understanding of others, a lot more listening. And I think what's interesting about this particular phrase, every taste has its value, is we've tended to cultivate aesthetic tastes and things in our art which are either beautiful. There's a sort of tyranny of the beautiful if you look at art through time. There's a politicization of the female form, for instance, which has been very harmful and degrading to a lot of folks. A lot of people are mired or undermined by the art that's come before us. And again, not a manifesto. It's more of a way of looking at the world that's just different. I want a different tool set. I don't want to have to be beautiful over the time. My last poem that I shared with you in the last episode was about watching porn incessantly and being disgusted with what I see. Well, porn itself is an art form that acquires aesthetic objects and objectifies women, and it puts them in sort of demeaning positions. Now, there's a whole other, that's a whole other topic, but that poem explores things that are awful about that particular art form, if you want to call it an art form. That doesn't mean you demonize the people doing it, and it doesn't mean that you demonize that industry or that you do any of these other things. It just means, what values does that show? What value does your art show? Think about it. Construct it. But if you're just putting out beautiful things and you're going back to the most shallow understanding of like Greek form, where everything like beauty is truth, I think you're just jerking off. You're jerking off and you're monetizing it and you're selling it. And I don't want to say that's bad, because fuck, I'd love to make a living making art. AKA I'm in swim trunks and a polo shirt filming in my bathroom, right? So that's where my type of poetry has gotten me so far. But what I would say is that I've approached my art as honestly as I possibly could. And without that feeling of veracity and showing the beautiful and the ugly, I think it's Basho, the outhouse and the moonflower, showing those two things in the same field says something entirely different than just having beauty all the time, or having fat people be funny all the time. I'm fat, I can say that. People laugh at me all the time when it's totally inappropriate. Jack Black can only be a comedian. No one will take him seriously if he had a dramatic romantic comedy. They just wouldn't accept it. So the thought is, let's break out of that mode. Okay, it won't sell well at first, but if we keep offering it, you know what? People like me who are somewhat heavy set would appreciate being represented in a field, an art field, where we're not ridiculous, where we're not funny, where we have emotions and feelings, where homeless people, where all these other folks are represented in a way that they can be taken seriously, that they can believe in the world around them, and that they're not an outcast or a sequestered set of people, an offset of a society that only values beauty, to the extent where only pretty people talk on television. Fuck that. So my unmanifesto, or my reverse manifesto, is beautiful people are awesome. I know so many gorgeous, wealthy, wonderful people. Some of them might be watching this video. I don't dislike you, or I don't have any problem with you. I have a problem with the way that we artificially only talk about you. It's unfair to you because it objectifies you, and it denies entire classes of people access to meaning. You've already learned too much nonsense. Embrace all techniques. Apply all 40 hours to the day. Keep breathing. Turn your back to the critic and curators of common sense. Just find something you love and do it. I believe in you. Open. Open. I spent a lot of time thinking about this, particularly curators of common sense line. How do I say this? There is no common sense. There never has been a common sense. Common sense is an idea that developed to basically say, we have these shared values and it says X and that has outputs Y. Our means justify our ends and everything's all good. Well, common sense only works in a culture that everyone's the same. And that's just not what we live in. I prefer a cosmopolitan world. I prefer a world in which we're equals to the extent we can make that happen. I prefer a world in which we talk to the janitor and the lawyer and get to know both of them. I prefer, because I know great lawyers and I know great janitors. I've done so many things between white collar and blue collar and lower income work. I've been trained as an infantry soldier. I've been trained to work on jet engines. I've been trained as a social worker. I've been trained as a bulk laborer at UPS, where I worked my ass off. I did 8 hours of work in a 4-hour shift and got paid hardly anything to do it. Which is not to say I'm superior, it's just to say I'm a hybrid. I am all of these things. I've rubbed elbows with famous people. One of the most beautiful famous people I ever met was Stevie Wonder, who should never talk to a guy like me, but he did. He opened up, he was honest, he had an entourage, yes, but he was gentle, open, listening. And wouldn't it be an amazing world if, I hate to use the word proletariat or plebeian, if they were just as open as Stevie Wonder, or had the facility and an ability to do that? What if we fostered a world in which that could happen? And again, it's not a manifesto, it's just an idea. What if we adopted this mode? What would happen? What is the terror that creates in certain classes? Why are we so worried about this shit? So my suggestion, again, is to look at the usage of our art, to look at the utility of our art, to look at and move beyond the utilities that have been placed before us, and start looking at multimodal art, look at multidisciplinary art, Look at things that transgress boundaries. And by transgress, I do mean, yeah, it's a transgression. It freaks people out when you have a dancer with poetry. It freaks people out when you do poetry videos, because they're like, oh, that's not really the art. Oh, they're just, dude, the gestalt of hybrid work is amazing. Multi-sensory, or things that assault us on multiple levels, are beautiful. Which is not to say we must act that way, because like anyone else, I love a great poem. I love a great rap song. I love pop music. I love heavy metal. I love classical music, going all the way back into the really weird stuff like the 12-tone or dodecaphonic music. And I've practiced a lot of these forms. And what I can tell you is each knowledge builds on the other. So there's a fluidity and a flow between all of these arts. There's a beautiful intersection when a piece comes together and it's using all and firing on all these levels that is more interesting to me than the sums of the individual arts themselves. Again, not a prescription. So you don't need to blindly follow this. You don't even need to accept it as a thing. You could tell me I'm full of shit. But I think there's wonderful art to be had when we start integrating spoken word technique into our academic poetry and vice versa. This next poem I'm about to share with you, Fountain, it's the first section of Fountain, Faustina the Nazi Wonder Woman. It's a hybrid. First off, it's an ekphrastic poem that uses the initial text and adapts it, which is a visual text, Wonder Woman, which has sound and video. It's from the Linda Carter series back in, I want to say, 76. And it describes the scene, and then it just goes wild from there. It goes into a very, very heady essay about both my gender construction, my sexuality, how it affected me. It's kind of a reporting back in essay form of how that piece deeply ingrained all sorts of crazy things like S&M, feminism. That's not to say that feminism is crazy, but crazy in the sense of all the juxtapositions it raised at one time. What is truth? What is it to be an American? What is it to be a displaced American fighting for America? What is Linda Carter saying? What is she feeling? What is it that we see? Why are we attracted to her? Why do we want to fuck Linda Carter? Sorry, it's crass, but it's true. I mean, my first impulse ever in my entire life towards a female other than my mom was sexual attraction to Linda Carter, who remains to me to be one of the most potent visual and personas in my life. I want to get at that, and I can't get at that without having multiple modes of expression so that I can get through to this is what I saw, this is what I felt, and this is the rhetoric of image and the things that I've seen repeated in my society over and over again that have made me maybe hostile towards women at one point, but now I've come around to a point of almost wanting to be a woman because I'm disgusted by a lot of the masculinization that I see in the world around me. So, again, it is a complicated piece. It is an intense piece. There are moments of beauty. Linda Carter is an amazing person. Gal Gadot in the reboot is amazing. These things are powerful and beautiful. And to report back on them, to bring them in as an ekphrasis into my work, to talk about and report back to what I felt about it, to give back to the world around me what I feel, I also have to talk about what I think, which involves rhetoric. Another thing that's shunned by a lot of academic poetry. And maybe this is overstated. Maybe I'm just too much in my head. But I think that for myself, I'm interested in these multimodal forms, in multidisciplines, and the way they cross over, the way they intersect. And I want to invite you to make art like that. But that means that you have to pick up all these tools along the way, which might be scary, they might be awkward, you might not be good at it. I'm terrible at dance. I should never be on a dance floor. I love dance. I think it's the most amazing, beautiful thing in the world. And yet, I'll never be able to perform at a level of even a rudimentary dancer. I'll never be involved in a courtship dance. I have 7 left feet. and 3 right noses or right nostrils, whatever you want to say. It's just terrible. But dance taught me how to talk about opening a space for a listener to move into. And that Tao, that flow, that way, that Jeet Kune Do, if you want to borrow from Bruce Lee, be like water, who was in turn borrowing from the Tao Te Ching. All these texts adapted, collapsing, and amalgamating throughout time are now in this piece. And this piece, though it probably won't have much viewership, it will spread out. It's another pebble in that pond. Keep riding those waves. Hope you enjoy my poem. Please talk with me. I'd love to talk about art and poetry and thought and etymology and ontology. I'm really passionate about it because I think it's our way of giving back to our community in a way that you can't without art. Thank you. Hope you like my poem. Fountain, Fausta, the Nazi Wonder Woman, 28th April, 1976. Wonder Woman falls through the trap door. The Commandant grabs her from behind, forces her to breathe heavily through his chloroform rag. My first experience pressed against the hardwood floor. His wide-brimmed headgear, red swatch on his right shoulder, black swastika on a round white field, stolen lasso of truth wrapped around her writhing form, decked in American iconography. Each deliberate gasp and eye roll an effort. Each deliberate gasp and eye roll an effort to entice us watching, U.S. watching, to delay this painful interrogation of projected self by the others, or is it the uniform? In the end, you will admit to anything. In the end, you will admit to anything for this torture to stop. I am terrified to write this. I wasn't even 4 years old when I first saw those images. What mechanisms were put into play to set me in front of that TV set and encode my first sexual thought, impulse, and love at once? And was I just a receiver or an active participant? Or was I primed somehow to transmit my first brush with dominance and submission, feminism and affection for the first female being other than my mother? Did I know to leap for it, for her, or was I shoved? If they begin with gaining control over libidinal energies, the desire to control desire, and the siphoning of that energy into the state apparatus, the fascist sublimating the democratic becomes a sick romance, then they can market to us the masculinized gestalt of the striker over the stricken, creating an aggregate of Betty Page-like images wrapped like jingoistic, hyperbolic representations of sex play, in which only the masculine narrative is recording. It follows that the new truth is elicited through the binding of the democratic model by that narrative controlled entirely by an interrogation driven by fascist whim and design, culminating in the romantic notions of the elite few of which we plebeians are not a part, concentrated more and more energy at the top of a hierarchy at the expense of we, base most and most fucked bottom. Delusional, we get off on believing we are or could be among those elites too. Delusional, we get off on believing we are or could be among those elite too. And if we were to strip away the initial masculine response of desire at the once strong but now subdued female form, an inherent context instilled in the character by her male creator, and look to Linda Carter, who emphatically stated that her character was not sexualized but empowered, we can begin to strip away the gaze that lingers and recognize that for Carter, the grunting, grasping, gasping, eye-rolling were not sexual. They were the physical manifestations of Wonder Woman defending herself from assault, interrogation, and torture. Carter surely knew herself, and by knowing herself, she left an alternative story for us to read in her performance, in the way she carried herself, in the way she talked about herself after the performance. That a woman knowing herself within a field of profound dignity and with an agency is in and of itself attractive does not dispel or undermine what made her attractive. The attraction and its mechanism are distributed in two non-intersecting milieus. The personhood of Carter, entirely separate from our desire for her to submit to us. She, the body acting as Wonder Woman, never meeting the perceived she who was acted upon by the Nazi, and through the Nazi, the voyeur at home in the audience. My love of my understanding of her is tertiary to her love of herself, which could never be elided by desire, despite the hegemonic force applied to the bodies of women through its twisted narratives that have taken me years to even partially unlearn, a force spun from pronatal economic needs, drawn from the cloaks of the charlatan, the politician, the cloistered parson, and your average daily jackass. Me, we, us. Is it wrong for me as a male to look up to Wonder Woman, her amazing strength and dignity, and to look up to Carter for her character and resilience? Is it wrong for me as a male to want to be around this assemblage of her, to be more like her, or even to be her? Is there a way to lose my assigned maleness, even if only for a little while, to pursue what Wonder Woman and one of the actresses who played her came to mean to me as I grew with the idea of her? Is there a way for me to lose myself entirely, left behind for a moment as unimportant so I could really just listen to her? Can we who act as libertines, as the great grandchildren of the Marquis de Sade, finally give up the belief that we are only free and expressing our liberty to the degree by which we harass, market, subjugate, enslave, kill, or molest our fellow beings? Delusional, we get off on believing we are or could be among that elite too. And if we were to strip away the initial masculine response of desire at the once strong but now subdued female form, an inherent context instilled in the character by her male creator, and look to Linda Carter, who emphatically stated that her character was not sexualized but empowered, we can begin to strip away the gaze that lingers and recognize that for Carter, the grunting, gasping, eye-rolling were not sexual. They were the physical manifestations of Wonder Woman defending herself from assault, interrogation, and torture. Carter surely knew herself, and by knowing herself, she left an alternate story for us to read in her performance, her body language, and the way she talked about her performance. That a woman knowing herself within a field of profound dignity and with an agency is in and of itself attractive does not dispel or undermine what made her attractive in the first place. The attraction and its mechanism are distributed in two non-intersecting milieu. The personhood of Carter entirely separate from our desire for her to submit to us. She, the body acting as Wonder Woman, never meeting the perceived she who was acted upon by the Nazi, and through the Nazi, the voyeur at home in the audience. My love of my understanding of her is tertiary to her love of herself, which could never be elided by desire, despite the hegemonic force applied to the bodies of women through its twisted narratives that have taken me years to even partially unlearn, a force spun from pronatal economic needs, drawn from the cloaks of the charlatan, the politician, the cloistered parson, and your average daily jackass. Is it how you say things that gets it across? I don't know. Let me try again. My love of my understanding of her is tertiary to her love of herself, which could never be elided by desire, despite the hegemonic force applied to the bodies of women through its twisted narratives that have taken me years to even partially unlearn. A force spun from pronatal economic needs, drawn from the cloaks of the charlatan, politician, the cloistered parson, and your average daily jackass, who's just trying themselves to get by. Let's not make excuses for them, but it's taking me years to learn to stop screaming and to start talking, start trying to be understood, start listening, start caring, and those things don't require a yelling man to perform. Thank you. Take care and be good to each other.